Elon Musk attends a lecture on business management at one of the country's top universities. A liberal professor known for criticizing capitalists decides to take the opportunity to publicly embarrass Musk. Stay tuned for the ending of this story, and don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on new stories. The auditorium on the university campus was filled to capacity. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. Students were whispering excitedly among themselves, and some of them were already taking photos of the hall, knowing that today would be special. The business management lecture was behaving normally until word spread through the halls of the university. Elon Musk himself was attending. The auditorium's entrance doors opened, and a tall man in a dark jacket and black t-shirt walked calmly inside. His steps were light, his face was impassive, but his attentive gaze slid along the rows of students, assessing the situation. Elon sat closer to the center, not standing out, as if this was a normal meeting for him. However, he knew that it was not. Professor Arthur Henderson stood at the lectern, a man in his 50s with slicked back hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expensive suit. He was known as a vocal critic of corporate elites, who believed that entrepreneurs like Musk were creating the illusion of innovation while actually thinking only about their own profit. He couldn't pass up this opportunity. "We're going to have an interesting conversation today," he began, pausing meaningfully. "We're talking about business management. And today we have in our audience a man who has become the embodiment of capitalist success. Mr. Musk, I'm glad to see you here." Some of the students turned to Elon, who merely nodded in response, his face impassive. "Managing a business," the professor continued, "is not just about creating products or hiring employees. It is about responsibility to society. A responsibility that not all corporate executives have enough of." The professor's words caused a slight wave of discussion among the students. Musk, without changing his expression, watched this with restraint, as if waiting for a continuation. Let's start with a simple question. Who in this room thinks that the biggest businessmen of our time care about ordinary people? The professor looked around the audience, raising an eyebrow. A few hands went up, but most of the students either hesitated or looked at Elon, waiting for his reaction. "You see," Henderson continued with a slight chuckle, "people understand that business is a game for the powerful. And ordinary people are always pawns." Some students chuckled, some nodded approvingly, but overall the audience remained wary. Everyone understood that this was some kind of intellectual confrontation. "Mr. Musk," the professor turned to Elon, "could you explain how your business management philosophy fits into this balance of power?" Elon, without changing his position, calmly looked at the professor. There was no irritation in his gaze, rather curiosity, as if he were evaluating the course of a chess game. "I think business is, first and foremost, problem-solving," he finally answered. "If you solve them well, you're successful. If you don't, you disappear. It's that simple." The answer was terse, but the audience sensed the hidden power in it. Some students felt the professor was expecting a more formal answer, but Musk preferred to speak directly. "Interesting," Henderson drawled. "So you think corporate social responsibility is just problem-solving?" "Social responsibility is a consequence of efficiency," Elon replied, bowing his head slightly. "If a company creates technology that improves people's lives, it is already acting responsibly." The professor narrowed his eyes slightly, but said nothing. He realized that Musk would not respond to provocations. The students watched this intellectual duel, anticipating where this meeting would lead. This was only the beginning. The audience froze in anticipation. Some were quickly typing messages on their phones, sharing the news with friends. Others were secretly filming what was happening on their cameras. Elon Musk's presence in the room changed the usual course of the lecture. The students could not distract themselves from the thought that they were about to witness something special. But Musk, sitting in the middle of the room, looked as if he was completely unfazed by what was happening. Professor Arthur Henderson pretended nothing had changed and continued his lecture, but there was a special tension in his voice. He adjusted his glasses, looked around the audience, and began to speak with his usual confidence. "Today we are discussing business management. It is not just numbers, not just strategies for increasing income. It is a system in which the decisions of some people determine the fate of millions. And often these decisions are made not in the interests of society, but in the interests of the managers themselves. Some of the students looked at each other. They knew the professor was hinting at Musk, but the entrepreneur didn't react. He just stared straight ahead, showing no emotion. I want to ask you, students, one question. The professor continued, making a dramatic pause. If you had power, would you think about people or would you focus on personal gain? Several students raised their hands. Of course, about people, someone answered. But business cannot exist without profit, another noted. The professor smiled, pleased that the audience had joined in the discussion. Now imagine that you have a huge corporation, powerful resources, the ability to change the world. He continued. But with this ability comes responsibility. For example, if you cut employees to save money, and then say that you are doing it for the good of the company, is that justified? There were some approving nods from somewhere in the room, but now everyone was waiting for Musk to speak. The professor turned to him with a slight grin. Mr. Musk, as a person who runs huge corporations, do you think it is possible to combine business efficiency and moral obligations to society? Elon paused, as if considering his answer, but then spoke in an even, confident voice. If a business is inefficient, it does not benefit anyone. Not investors, not employees, not society. The professor raised his eyebrows slightly. So you think that firing thousands of people is also a benefit? Several students giggled, clearly falling for the subtle provocation. Musk didn't smile. He looked straight at the professor and then said calmly, I believe that if a company does not develop, then everyone loses. Employees, shareholders, clients. The only way to grow is to adapt. A tense silence fell over the room. Some students surreptitiously wrote down Musk's words on their notebooks. Henderson steepled his fingers and pretended to consider his answer. What about social responsibility? He finally asked. Shouldn't successful companies give something back to society? Musk tilted his head slightly to the side, as if the professor had asked him a really interesting question. Successful companies do this all the time. Tesla, for example, is accelerating the world's transition to clean energy. SpaceX is making space accessible. Neuralink is working on treating neurological diseases. That's contributing to society. The room began to buzz again. Some students liked this answer, others clearly expected more. The professor decided to continue. He knew Musk was well prepared, but he was sure he would find a way to corner him. He just had to wait a little. Professor Henderson felt that his plan was not yielding the expected results. Musk was not simply ignoring the provocations, he was responding clearly, logically, and without emotion, as if he was not at all offended by the attempts to put him in an unfavorable light. This did not suit the professor. He knew that the audience was watching their dialogue closely, and he was confident that he would still be able to show the entrepreneur in what he considered his true light. Okay, Mr. Musk, Henderson said, adjusting his glasses and stepping forward. You say your business is making the world a better place. But what about the working conditions? Tesla, for example, has been accused of overexploiting its workers. People were working 12-hour days, forced to sleep on the factory floor. How does that fit into your understanding of efficiency? A slight murmur ran through the audience. Some students were beginning to think that the professor had indeed asked an important question. Musk, without changing his expression, nodded calmly. People worked overtime because they believed in the project, he said. They knew they weren't just creating cars, they were creating the future. And if you ask them if they regret their choice, most will tell you they don't. The professor chuckled. So, in your opinion, if a person voluntarily agrees to work in grueling conditions, this justifies the company? It means they had freedom of choice, Musk said calmly. A freedom that many people fight for, but not everyone understands. Some of the students began to whisper again. Musk spoke confidently and, most importantly, he did not allow the professor to paint him into a corner. Henderson decided to change tactics. If he couldn't catch Musk in his controversial business practices, he would try playing on something else, his image. Your behavior on social media is also much discussed. The professor began with a grin. For example, your Twitter posts often cause scandals. Have you ever thought that a billionaire responsible for thousands of jobs shouldn't behave like a teenager? A few students laughed, but Musk again showed no emotion. He just raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he was really thinking about the professor's words. Are you saying that a billionaire shouldn't be sincere? I'm saying the billionaire should be careful. Henderson replied. Then why do people prefer to follow my tweets rather than the statements of traditional media? The professor froze for a moment. The question had been put in such a way that there was no easy answer. The audience was no longer just listening, now the students were watching two points of view clash. Probably because in today's world, popularity and quality are not the same thing. The professor replied, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. Or maybe because people are tired of lies and hypocrisy. Musk said. There was silence. A few students applauded approvingly, but Elon did not pursue the topic. He simply leaned back in his chair and calmly waited for the next question. Henderson realized he was losing control of the situation. He knew the next chapter of this discussion would be decisive. Professor Henderson sensed that the audience was no longer paying as close attention to his words as they had been at the beginning of the lecture. He was used to being the center of attention, but now it seemed as if the students were more interested in Elon Musk's reactions than in his questions. It was irritating. He couldn't let the billionaire whose business practices were so controversial simply gain the upper hand in this verbal duel. He needed to find a point of pressure, a question that Musk couldn't answer with his usual ease. The professor adjusted his glasses and stepped closer to the center of the stage. He knew he had to attack more forcefully now, without innuendo or veiled accusations. Okay, Mr. Musk. He began, deliberately slow for effect. We've discussed your companies, your views on business, your reputation on social media. But there's one topic you've always been evasive about. Musk raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. I'm talking about your political position, said the professor. There was a murmur in the audience. Someone let out a barely audible breath. The topic of politics was always a slippery one, especially in academia, where the faculty often held progressive views. Don't you think a man with your influence should not interfere in political matters? Henderson continued. One moment you support one politician, the next you oppose another. One moment you criticize government regulation, the next you ask for subsidies for your companies. What is that called? He paused, giving the audience time to digest his words. Double standards? Some of the students laughed, but not as confidently as before. They waited for Musk's answer. Elon smiled slightly, not as someone who had been put in an awkward position, but as someone who had anticipated this question. I am not interfering in politics, but in common sense, he answered calmly. There was silence in the audience. When politicians make decisions that harm progress, I speak out. When laws hinder innovation, I explain why that's bad. It's not double standards. It's logic. The professor clearly did not expect such an answer. He quickly changed tactics. Then why are you so often accused of manipulation? You use Twitter to influence markets, cryptocurrency, Tesla stock prices. Isn't that an abuse of power? Musk shrugged. I express my opinion. People make their own decisions. If my words bother someone so much, maybe the problem is not with me? Silence again. Now some of the students were looking at the professor with interest. Would he be able to continue? Henderson pursed his lips. He felt like he had Musk cornered, but the billionaire remained composed. So you don't feel responsible for the consequences of your words? I feel responsible for the future. That is why I say what I think is necessary. The students looked at each other. Even those who had been skeptical of Musk began to wonder. The professor realized that he had only one option left. He had to make the final move. And he already knew what it would be. Professor Henderson realized that his attacks had missed the mark. He had been counting on an emotional response, on Musk making excuses or, at best, making a mistake. But Musk remained unperturbed, answering calmly and confidently, without a trace of irritation. Moreover, the audience was no longer just watching, they were on Musk's side. But the professor was not about to give in. He straightened up, ran his hand over the lapel of his jacket, and pretended to be deep in thought. "Okay," he said, as if agreeing with something invisible. "Let's look at the situation from the other side." He paused. "You think your influence on the world is purely positive. But what if I told you it was dangerous? What if technological power concentrated in the hands of one man threatens democracy? After all, no one elected you, no one gave you the right to decide where humanity should go." The audience began to whisper again. Now the professor had found a point that could indeed be a weak spot. Musk looked at him carefully, as if this was the first time in the entire lecture that the professor had asked a truly interesting question. Then he calmly folded his hands on the table and said, "The world has always been ruled by those who create something. Not those who simply talk about problems, but those who solve them." Henderson narrowed his eyes. "So you admit that you consider yourself superior to others?" Musk smiled slightly, not like a man caught in a lie, but like someone who had heard this question hundreds of times. "I believe that everyone has the opportunity to change the world. It's just that not everyone takes advantage of it." "But not everyone has billions like you," the professor chuckled. "Money doesn't make a person a leader," Musk replied. "Otherwise, every rich person would be an innovator." Someone in the audience nodded. The argument was simple but logical. The professor fell silent. He was looking for new arguments, but he knew his time was up. All his attempts to corner Musk had failed. He looked at the audience, and for the first time in many years, he felt that he had lost them. The silence was broken by one of the students. "Mr. Musk," he asked, "what do you think makes a leader successful?" Musk looked at him and smiled. "The ability to not be afraid of questions." And the hall exploded with applause. Professor Henderson exhaled slowly. At that moment, he realized that he had lost. But the most amazing thing was that he wasn't even angry. He saw before him a man who wasn't just defending himself from attacks, but who actually believed in what he was saying. And perhaps that made the professor think more than any words.